A powerful CEO disguised himself as a maintenance worker to spy on his own company when he met a woman who changed his life forever. Corporate secrets came to light, and an impossible love was born between completely different worlds, transforming not only their lives but the fate of an entire company. A story of authenticity, transformation, and true love that will touch your heart. Get ready, because this journey will make you rethink the meaning of success. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and comment where you're watching from. Sometimes we need to look through other eyes to discover who we truly are. The clock struck 8:30 in the evening as Alexander Reed walked down the hallway of the 20th floor of Reed Tower. His footsteps echoed on the Italian marble as he adjusted his silk tie. The reflection in the windows returned the image of a successful 38-year-old man. Immaculate suit, perfectly styled hair, and the upright posture of someone accustomed to others bowing to his presence. Behind the mahogany doors of the boardroom, the voices of his executives filtered through like a constant murmur. Alexander paused, allowing himself a moment before entering. He knew his presence would transform the room. Casual conversations would turn formal, postures would straighten, and calculated smiles would instantly appear. With his hand on the doorknob, something stopped him. A clear voice stood out among the others. "The problem with Alexander is that he's never had to worry about anything real in his life," said Richard Parker, his financial director. "How do you expect him to understand the problems of ground floor employees when his biggest concern is which imported car model he'll buy this year?" Laughter followed the comment, complicit and carefree. Alexander felt his jaw tighten and his breathing become deeper. "In his defense," continued Ellen Morgan, marketing director, "his strategies have doubled our profits in 3 years. Maybe he doesn't need to understand people to run an empire." "That's precisely the problem," interjected another voice that Alexander recognized as Martin Sullivan, his operations director. "He runs an empire, not a company with real people. To him, we're numbers on a spreadsheet." Alexander silently backed away, his reflection fragmenting in the tinted glass of the hallway. The echo of those words resonated in his mind as he observed the illuminated city at his feet from the window. Everything he saw belonged to him in some way: investments, properties, influences. And yet at that moment he felt strangely empty. A thought began to form in his mind, first as a rebellious spark, then as a defined idea that took shape until it became a plan. If his executives thought he was disconnected from reality, he would prove them wrong, not through arguments or corporate restructuring, but through direct experience. "I'm going to get to know my company from the bottom up," he murmured to himself, watching how the city lights flickered like inverted stars. "And we'll see who's really disconnected." The reflection returned by the window was no longer the same. For the first time in years, Alexander Reed smiled at a challenge that couldn't be solved with money. Alexander woke up in his 5,000-square-foot penthouse with panoramic views of the city. The dawn light filtered through the automated curtains that silently opened at the same time every morning. For a moment he contemplated the minimalist ceiling design, while the events of the previous night returned to his memory. He slowly sat up, observing the clinical perfection of his room: the king-size bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, imported furniture from exclusive designers, paintings by contemporary artists whose value increased each year. Everything selected with precision, nothing left to chance. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," greeted Thomas, his personal assistant, entering with a breakfast tray and the day's newspaper. "Your schedule begins in an hour with the video call with Japanese investors. Afterward, you have lunch with the mayor, and in the afternoon, the meeting with the international expansion team." Alexander nodded distractedly as he took the cup of coffee prepared with beans personally selected during his last trip to Colombia. His thoughts were still on the conversation he had overheard. "Thomas, how long have you been working for me?" The assistant seemed surprised by the personal question, unusual for his employer. 7 years, sir." "And do you think I know my company well? Not the figures or projects, but the people who work there." Thomas hesitated, carefully calibrating his response. "You know what's necessary to run it successfully, sir." Alexander gave a bitter smile. It was the diplomatic answer he expected. "I need you to do something different," he said, placing the cup on the nightstand. "I want you to prepare an alternative identity for me. I'm going to work in my own company for a few months, without anyone knowing who I really am." Thomas's expression went from surprise to concern. Sir, with all due respect, have you considered the implications? The board of directors, the shareholders, your international commitments? You'll take care of all that, Alexander interrupted. You'll say I'm on a strategic retreat, working on new directions for the company. Limited communication, only essentials will go through you. Meanwhile, I need a credible profile as a maintenance employee or similar. Alexander got up and walked to the closet the size of a standard apartment. His perfectly aligned suits by colors and seasons seemed to look at him with disapproval. It won't be easy, sir, Thomas insisted. You have no experience in normal jobs. Exactly, Alexander replied, turning to his assistant. That's precisely the point. As Thomas left to begin preparations, Alexander contemplated his reflection in the full-length mirror. Behind him, the city was waking up, a panorama of buildings among which Reed Tower stood out, a symbol of his business empire. Alexander Reed's story was the one that appeared in economic magazines and business profiles, heir to a modest fortune that he had exponentially multiplied thanks to a combination of fierce business intuition and relentless work ethic. What those profiles didn't mention were the emotional scars that had formed him. His father, an old-school businessman, had taught him that trust was a luxury that businessmen couldn't afford. People always seek their own benefit, Alexander, he constantly repeated. Remember that when they smile and flatter you. This lesson was reinforced during his university years, when he discovered that his girlfriend at the time was only interested in his last name and bank account. And again when his best friend tried to steal his first big business idea. With each disappointment, Alexander had built a higher wall around his personal life. Work became his refuge, success his validation. Personal relationships were reduced to calculated encounters and strategic alliances. His last serious relationship had ended 2 years ago, when Emily, a brilliant and passionate architect, told him that living with him was like inhabiting a beautiful empty building. The words had hurt more than he admitted, but he soon immersed himself in a new business acquisition that occupied all his time and thoughts. Now at 38, Alexander Reed had everything and yet nothing. His empire continued to grow, but his personal life was a carefully designed desert. None of his business achievements had filled the emptiness he felt in moments of solitude, like this one in front of the mirror, wondering who the man behind the empire really was. 3 days later, an unrecognizable man looked at himself in the mirror of a modest rented apartment in a middle-class neighborhood. Alexander's hair, once perfectly styled, now looked longer and disheveled, dyed a darker tone. A stubble of several days partially covered his face, and thick-rimmed glasses completed the transformation. Italian suits had been replaced by jeans, simple t-shirts, and a worn jacket. Albert Wilson, he pronounced aloud, practicing his new identity. Her skillfully fabricated resume provided him with a credible history, maintenance experience in several medium-sized companies, incomplete technical studies, and references that actually connected with trusted employees who had been partially informed of the plan. The personal history had also been carefully crafted. Divorced, no children, recently moved to the city looking for a new beginning. Common enough not to arouse curiosity, vague enough to avoid deep questions. The apartment is functional, commented Thomas, looking disapprovingly at the 600-square-foot space. Although I still think this is unnecessarily extreme, we could have found something more comfortable. That would defeat the purpose, Alexander replied, observing the kitchen dining area that would fit entirely in his walk-in closet. I need to experience real life, not a sugar-coated version. The assistant sighed, handing him a basic mobile phone. This device has a secure messaging app. Only I will have access. For emergencies only, he emphasized. Your interview is scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. The maintenance manager is instructed to hire you, but he doesn't know your true identity. Alexander nodded, feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and excitement that he hadn't experienced since his early days as an entrepreneur. And the company? Everything under control? I've informed the board about your strategic retreat. They're concerned, but I've managed to calm them. I'll handle daily operations and consult you on important decisions. Crucial meetings have been rescheduled or will be conducted virtually with the excuse that you're working from a remote location. Excellent. Alexander approached the apartment window. From there he could see in the distance the profile of Reed Tower illuminated among the buildings. Tomorrow the experiment begins. When Thomas left, Alexander found himself alone in a silence he wasn't used to. There was no service staff moving discreetly through the hallways, no constant sound of notifications from his latest generation phone, just the distant murmur of traffic and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. He tried to prepare a simple dinner, discovering with frustration that even the most basic tasks were challenging when he had never performed them himself. The egg broke incorrectly, the oil splattered, and the final result was barely edible. But strangely, that small culinary disaster gave him a satisfaction he hadn't felt in a long time, that of facing a real, tangible problem without assistance solving it for him. That night, lying on a bed that creaked with every movement, Alexander contemplated the cracked ceiling with an ironic smile. For the first time in years, he didn't know exactly what the next day would bring. And that uncertainty, instead of worrying him, felt curiously refreshing. The sun was barely beginning to rise when Alexander, now Albert, was already waiting at the service entrance of Reed Tower. Dressed in a blue maintenance uniform that felt rough to the touch, he observed the employees arriving in waves, first the cleaning and maintenance staff, then the mid-level administrators, and finally, closer to 9, the executives in their luxury cars. "Oh, you must be the new guy," said a gruff voice behind him. Alexander turned to find Steve Matthews, the maintenance manager, a stocky man in his 50s with calloused hands and an evaluating gaze. "Albert Wilson, right?" "Yes, sir," Alexander replied, extending his hand with a firmness that seemed to impress the supervisor. "There are no sirs here, son, just Steve," he replied with a rough laugh. "Come on, I'll show you your area and explain your duties." Over the next few hours, Alexander received a tour of the intricacies of the building he had commissioned but never really known: maintenance rooms, ventilation ducts, service accesses, and machine rooms. Essential places for the functioning of the skyscraper, but invisible to the executives working on the upper floors. Your job is to maintain floors 12 to 18. Mainly routine checks, changing lights, adjusting air conditioning, and responding to any requests from departments, Steve explained as he handed him a cart with tools. "Do you have experience with electrical systems?" "Some," Alexander replied vaguely, aware that his theoretical knowledge of electrical installations would probably not serve him much in practice. "You'll learn on the job." Steve gave him a pat on the shoulder. "Your first task is on the 15th floor Corporate Social Responsibility Department. They're having problems with the air conditioning." Arriving at the 15th floor, Alexander was surprised. This department wasn't like the others. Instead of the cold corporate environment that characterized most of the building, the social responsibility area had a warmer, more personal feel. The walls displayed photographs of community projects, plants decorated the spaces, and the furniture, although professional, seemed more welcoming. While confusedly examining the air conditioning control panel, trying to remember the little he knew about HVAC systems, a female voice startled him. "Need help with that?" Turning around, Alexander found himself face to face with a woman in her mid-30s with a serene but firm presence. She wore her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dressed in a simple but elegant blouse and formal pants. She didn't wear the excess of jewelry or elaborate makeup so common among the female executives he knew, but there was something in her posture and in the clarity of her gaze that radiated quiet confidence. "I'm the new maintenance guy," he introduced himself, uncomfortably aware of his clumsiness with the tools. "They sent me to check the air conditioning. I'm Victoria Owen, department director." She introduced herself with a warm smile, extending her hand. Unlike many executives who barely looked at maintenance staff, she looked him directly in the eyes. "The problem has been happening for weeks. It overheats in the afternoons and then freezes in the morning." Alexander nodded, buying time as he tried to decipher the control panel. "This model has a little trick," she continued, coming closer. "You need to reset the temperature sensor first before adjusting the programming." With a naturalness that surprised him, Victoria pointed to a small tab on the back of the panel. Alexander followed her instructions, wondering how a department director knew these technical details. "My father was an HVAC technician," she explained, as if reading his thoughts. "I grew up surrounded by tools and disassembled devices on the kitchen table." As they worked together on adjusting the system, Alexander discreetly observed the department's dynamics. Unlike other floors where he had perceived tension and rigid hierarchies, here employees seemed relaxed and engaged. Several approached Victoria with questions, which she answered with genuine attention. "Have you been with the company long?" Victoria asked as they finished with the air conditioning. "It's my first day," Alexander admitted. "Then welcome to Reed Enterprises," she smiled. "What do you think so far?" Alexander carefully considered his response. "It's different from what I expected." "In what way?" "It's bigger than it seems from the outside," he improvised. "There's a whole world in here that most people don't see." Victoria nodded with an expression suggesting she understood perfectly what he meant. "Most people see only the shiny facade, the logo at the top of the building, but it's the people inside who really keep this running," she commented, "although I doubt the big boss sees it that way." "The big boss?" Alexander asked, feeling a twinge of curiosity. "Alexander Reed," she replied with a small smile. "The man from the 20th floor who rarely comes down to mingle with mortals." Alexander felt a knot in his stomach. "Do you know him personally?" "We've crossed paths in some meetings," said Victoria. "He's brilliant in business, no denying that. But—" She paused, as if reconsidering whether to continue. "But," Alexander insisted, unable to contain himself. "Let's just say there's a difference between running a business and leading people," she concluded diplomatically. "Anyway, thanks for the fix. If you need anything while you're adapting, my department is quite friendly." As he walked away with his tool cart, Alexander felt a mix of conflicting emotions. On one hand, the discomfort of hearing honest opinions about himself. On the other, a growing curiosity about Victoria Owen, a woman who clearly had a very different vision of the company he had built. The rest of the day passed in a succession of small humiliations. Tools he didn't know how to use correctly, systems he didn't understand, and the constant feeling of being invisible to many of the executives who, under other circumstances, would have been falling over themselves to attend to him. At the end of the workday, while waiting for the bus under a persistent drizzle, his car would have given away his true identity, Alexander reflected on his first day in the shadows. He had learned more about the actual functioning of his company in 8 hours as a janitor than in the past year from his executive office. And something told him this was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Alexander became increasingly immersed in his role as Albert. Each morning he woke up with muscle pains from the physical work he wasn't used to, but also with renewed energy he hadn't felt in a long time. The blisters on his hands, which initially seemed unbearable, began to harden, forming calluses, small medals of honor that marked his transformation. His relationship with the other maintenance employees evolved from initial distrust to camaraderie based on mutual respect. He learned that Steve, the maintenance manager, had worked at Reed Tower since its construction and knew every corner of the building better than its own architects. That James, the chief electrician, had raised 3 children alone after his wife died of cancer. That Betty, the cleaning lady who always arrived first, saved every penny to pay for her granddaughter's university. Human stories he would never have known from the isolation of his executive office. But it was the 15th floor, the social responsibility department, that aroused his greatest curiosity. With any valid excuse, Alexander found reasons to pass by there. A lamp that needed replacement, a desk that required adjustment, an outlet that mysteriously failed. Victoria always greeted him with the same warm smile, without the condescension he had noticed in other executives. During these brief interactions, Alexander collected fragments of information about her. She had a master's degree in sustainable development, had rejected offers from larger companies that paid better, and led several community projects that went beyond mere mandatory corporate responsibility. On a particularly busy Tuesday, Alexander was called to the 15th floor to help with the installation of a projector for an important presentation. While working, he couldn't help overhearing fragments of the conversation between Victoria and Simon, one of her assistants. "The budget they assigned us is insufficient, Victoria," Simon was saying, clearly frustrated. "The digital literacy project in marginalized neighborhoods needs at least 30% more funding to be effective." "I know," she replied calmly. "That's why I turned down the promotion." This information completely caught Alexander's attention. A promotion declined? In his experience, no one turned down promotions in the corporate world. "But being regional director would have given you more influence," Simon insisted. "And less time for the projects that really matter," Victoria replied. Plus, the offer came with conditions. Reduce the scope of the scholarship program to focus on more Photogenic initiatives. Big boss decisions, I suppose, sighed Simon. Actually, I've never discussed these projects directly with him, Victoria replied. Everything goes through intermediaries and committees. Sometimes I wonder if he really knows what we do down here. Alexander felt a pang of guilt. Indeed, he had never paid much attention to that department beyond ensuring it met legal and public image requirements. Later that same day, during the lunch break, Alexander found himself sitting alone in the employee cafeteria, a space he had never visited before. He observed the dynamics of the place. Groups formed according to departments, invisible but present hierarchies in the distribution of tables. "May I sit down?" Victoria was in front of him with a food tray, smiling at his evident surprise. In recent weeks, he had noticed that, unlike other directors, she usually ate with the rest of the staff instead of ordering service to her office or going out to exclusive restaurants. "Of course," he replied, sitting up slightly. "The new guy doesn't seem so new anymore," she commented as she sat down. "Steve says you learn quickly." "I'm trying to adapt," Alexander replied, aware of how ironic it was to receive praise for learning to work in his own company. "I've seen you observing a lot," said Victoria, "as if you were studying the place." For a moment, Alexander feared he had been discovered, but Victoria's expression showed no suspicion, only genuine curiosity. "I'm interested in human dynamics," he replied, finding refuge in partial truth. "How a company really works beyond the official organizational charts." Victoria smiled, as if she had found a kindred spirit. "That's exactly what I always say. Organizational charts show hierarchies, not real relationships." She paused to try her salad. "For example, did you know that Carol, from accounting, is who really makes the finance department work? The finance director may make the final decisions, but nothing happens without Carol's tacit approval." Alexander nodded, remembering the efficient secretary who had been with the company for decades and who indeed seemed to know everything about finances. The conversation flowed with surprising ease. Victoria told him about the social projects she managed, the communities they worked with, the small triumphs that rarely made it to official reports. Alexander found himself genuinely interested, asking questions that went beyond his maintenance role. "And you?" Victoria finally asked. "How did you end up here? You seem different from the typical maintenance worker." "No offense," she quickly added. "It's a long story," Alexander replied, careful. "Let's say I'm in a period of personal re-evaluation." "I know that feeling," she nodded. 3 years ago, I was at a multinational, earning triple with an office with sea views and a fiancé who ran his own company. The whole conventional success package. "What changed?" Alexander asked, genuinely intrigued. "I realized my job consisted mainly of creating the illusion that the company cared, while in reality we were just looking for the cheapest way to meet minimum requirements." Her gaze became distant for a moment. "There was a particular project, a fishing community affected by industrial pollution. We promised real help, but in the end it all came down to a public relations campaign and some symbolic donations." Alexander vaguely remembered that case. It had been a few years ago, a complicated situation with artisanal fishermen and an industrial plant. His company wasn't directly involved, but they had participated in a help consortium that indeed had served more as an image strategy than as a real solution. "And your fiancé?" he asked, surprising himself with the personal interest he felt. "It turned out our visions of life were incompatible," she replied with a resigned smile. "He believed everything has a price. I discovered that some things shouldn't have one." Before he could respond, the alarm on Victoria's watch went off, indicating the end of the break. "It's been an interesting conversation, Albert," she said, as she picked up her tray. "We should do it again." As he watched her walk away, Alexander experienced a disconcerting sensation. For the first time in years, he had had a genuine conversation with someone who expected nothing from him, who didn't know his power or wealth, who had simply treated him as an equal. And more disturbing still, he had enjoyed every minute of it. As the weeks passed, the shared lunches between Alexander and Victoria became an informal routine. Sometimes they were just 10 minutes stolen between responsibilities, other times longer conversations that extended until one of them had to reluctantly return to their duties. For Alexander, these moments had become an anchor in his strange double life. In the mornings before arriving at work, He briefly reviewed the critical reports that Thomas sent him and made executive decisions that kept his empire afloat. At night, he studied technical manuals to improve in his maintenance tasks, but those lunches with Victoria represented something different, a space where he wasn't playing a role or calculating advantages. He was simply being himself, discovering parts of himself that he had forgotten. "Have you ever thought about studying something more?" Victoria asked one day, while sharing coffee on the small terrace of the 15th floor, a space that few knew about and that had become their occasional refuge. Alexander carefully considered his response, mixing truth and fiction. "I studied business administration, actually," he said, which was true, but life took other paths. "Administration? Interesting contrast with your current skills," she commented with a smile. "I'm discovering there's a big difference between theory and practice," he replied, surprised by his own sincerity. "At university I learned about corporate strategies and profit maximization, but never about how a company really works at a human level." "That's exactly what I always say," Victoria nodded enthusiastically. "Companies aren't just numbers and processes. They're living organisms made of people, relationships, interconnected stories." Something in her passion when speaking completely captured Alexander's attention. It wasn't the typical corporate ambition he knew so well, nor the naive idealism he had found in some activists. It was something more balanced, more authentic. "You know what's most frustrating about my job?" she continued, looking toward the distant horizon line. "That I know exactly how this company could have a genuine social impact without sacrificing profitability, but I've never managed to get those ideas to really reach the top." "What would you do if you could speak directly with Reed?" Alexander asked, unable to resist the temptation. Victoria laughed softly. "I'd probably have about 30 seconds before his eyes glazed over with corporate boredom." "Try me," he insisted. "I have 30 seconds." She looked at him with curiosity, but accepted the challenge. Straightening up and adopting a more formal posture, she spoke with conviction. "Social responsibility initiatives shouldn't be isolated departments that exist to improve corporate image. They should be integrated into the DNA of every business decision. It's not about donating a percentage of profits, but about generating profits in a way that already incorporates social benefit." The pilot project we implemented in 3 communities has shown that this approach not only creates community loyalty and positive reputation, but also generates innovation and commitment among employees, reducing turnover and increasing productivity. With the right structure, we could turn Reed Enterprises into a global model of conscious capitalism, increasing shareholder value while creating measurable social impact. She finished exactly at 30 seconds, with a precision that suggested she had refined this speech many times in her mind. Alexander remained silent, genuinely impressed. What she proposed wasn't superficial charity, but a restructuring of business purpose that paradoxically could be more profitable in the long run. "Well?" she asked, with a mixture of humor and nervousness. "Did I convince the ghost of Alexander Reed?" "I think he would have to listen to you," he replied sincerely. "In another life, perhaps," she smiled. "Now, I have to get back. We have the community project presentation this afternoon." As he watched her walk away, Alexander remained thoughtful. Victoria's ideas resonated with thoughts he himself had had in the early days of his career, before relentless pragmatism and pressure for quarterly results dominated his business vision. That afternoon, instead of continuing with his usual tasks, Alexander decided to discreetly attend the community project presentation. From the back of the room, he observed how Victoria and her team presented the results of a technology training initiative in vulnerable neighborhoods. What impressed him most weren't the statistics or the moving testimonials, but the evident passion with which the entire team spoke about the project. It wasn't the manufactured enthusiasm he had seen in so many corporate presentations, but something genuine that came from personal conviction. At the end, while attendees chatted in small groups, Alexander noticed something unusual. One of the photographs projected during the presentation showed a community center that seemed strangely familiar to him. Approaching the informational panels arranged at the back of the room, he confirmed his suspicion. It was part of a project he had anonymously funded years ago, before corporate coldness consumed his original vision. "Impressive, isn't it?" Steve's voice, the maintenance manager, startled him. "Very," Alexander replied, trying to hide his shock. "I didn't know the company was involved in projects like this." "Actually, this particular one has a curious history," explained Steve. "It started as an anonymous donation years ago. No one knows exactly where the initial money came from, but Victoria transformed it from a simple computer center to a comprehensive community development program." Alexander felt a strange sensation in his chest. His anonymous donation, which he had considered little more than an occasional gesture of charity, had evolved into something much more significant thanks to people like Victoria. "My youngest son learned programming there," Steve continued with pride. "Now he's studying computer engineering. He would never have had that opportunity without that center." The revelation hit Alexander hard. There was a direct, though invisible, connection between a decision he made years ago and the real lives of people like Steve and his son, human connections that had formed without his knowledge, impacts that went beyond the statistical reports he usually received. That night, in his temporary modest apartment, Alexander was reviewing the reports Thomas had sent him when he noticed an unusual attached file titled Personal Philanthropic Projects, Historical Compilation. Upon opening it, he discovered that his assistant had been meticulously documenting all the anonymous donations and charitable projects Alexander had carried out over the years. Some he remembered clearly, others he barely recognized. What surprised him was seeing how many of them had evolved and grown, generating impacts he had never known about. With a growing sense of revelation, Alexander understood that he had been more connected with the type of vision Victoria defended than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. At some point, the young idealist who had initiated those projects had been buried under layers of business pragmatism and distrust. He looked out the window at the city lights. Somewhere among those buildings was Reed Tower, a symbol of his material success. But here in this small apartment, dressed as a common worker and connected with the real stories of people like Steve, Victoria, and so many others, he was beginning to rediscover a part of himself he thought was lost, a part that perhaps had never completely disappeared. The calendar marked almost 2 months since Alexander had begun his experiment, and the duality of his existence had become almost normal. As Albert, he had earned the respect of his maintenance colleagues and established a routine that included not only his work responsibilities, but also social rituals, shared coffees with Victoria, dominoes games on Fridays, after work with Steve and other colleagues, even an occasional visit to the modest family restaurant where Betty, the cleaning lady, helped on weekends. Each of these experiences had opened windows to a world he had only observed from afar. He had heard stories about the difficulties of making ends meet, about sick children without adequate health insurance, about dreams postponed for immediate needs. But he had also witnessed an everyday solidarity that surprised him. Employees sharing transportation to save money, exchanging shifts to help each other with family emergencies, organizing spontaneous collections when someone faced a crisis. That day, while adjusting a ventilation pipe on the 17th floor, Alexander overheard a conversation that caught his attention. "So, are you going to the company anniversary ball?" asked a female voice he recognized as belonging to Paula, an executive secretary. "I don't know," replied another male voice. "These events are always uncomfortable, the executives in their VIP section and us pretending we're one big happy family." "This year will be different," insisted Paula. "With the big boss absent on his mysterious retreat, they say it will be less formal. Plus, Victoria's department is organizing part of the event. You know how she is. She'll probably make it something more authentic. The anniversary ball." Alexander had completely forgotten about that annual tradition he himself had initiated a decade ago, although in recent years he had barely paid attention to the details, delegating all the organization. That afternoon, during his usual coffee with Victoria, it was she who brought up the subject. "Will you be going to the ball next Saturday?" she asked casually as they shared a sandwich in their usual spot on the terrace. "I wasn't aware," Alexander lied. "I don't know if I'd fit in at an event like that." "Of course you would," she insisted. "It's for all employees. Besides," she hesitated for a moment, "I'd like you to come." There was something in her tone, a barely perceptible vulnerability, that made Alexander's heart skip an inexplicable beat. "In that case, I suppose I could make an appearance," he replied, trying to sound casual while a strange emotion grew inside him. "Perfect," Victoria smiled. "My department is in charge of part of the organization this year. We are trying to break down some of the traditional barriers between departments." "What do you mean?" "Normally it's a very stratified event. Executives in their exclusive area, middle management in another section, and the rest of the staff practically invisible. This year we proposed a different format, with activities that mix people from all levels." Alexander nodded, remembering how he indeed barely interacted with employees outside the executive circle during these events. "With the CEO absent on his mysterious innovation retreat," she continued with an irony that made him feel uncomfortable, "the organizing committee has been more receptive to changes." The mention of his absence reminded Alexander of the growing complexity of his situation. How could he attend the ball as Albert without raising suspicions? And how would he justify Alexander Reed remaining absent during such a significant event for the company? That night, in a secure video call with Thomas, he discussed the dilemma. "It's impossible for me to attend as Albert without risking being discovered," Alexander reasoned. "There will be too many people who know my face, even with the disguise." "I could announce that you will briefly return for the event," suggested Thomas. "Her calculated moment of appearance as Alexander Reed, and then continue with your strategic retreat." "That would mean Albert couldn't attend," Alexander replied, surprising himself with the disappointment this idea caused him. "And is that a problem?" Thomas asked perceptively. Alexander remained silent for a moment, aware that his assistant had detected something that he himself was just beginning to recognize. "I made a promise," he said finally. "As Albert." Thomas observed him through the screen with an indecipherable expression. "Sir, may I speak frankly?" he finally asked. "Go ahead." "In these weeks, I've noticed a change in you. Your priorities, your questions about the company, even your tone when speaking about certain topics. And I wonder if this experiment is beginning to blur the lines between your two identities." Alexander considered the observation. It was true that something had changed. The experiences as Albert had begun to influence his decisions as Alexander. Recently he had questioned budget cuts that he would have approved without hesitation before. He had requested detailed reports on the impact of certain policies on lower-ranking staff. He had even initiated a review of the employee benefit system. "Perhaps that is precisely the purpose of all this, Thomas," he finally replied. "To discover if there is another way to run a company." "And Miss Owen?" Thomas asked carefully. "Is she also part of the experiment?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't talked much about Victoria in his reports to Thomas, aware that his interactions with her had acquired a personal meaning that went beyond his corporate research. "She's an exceptional employee," he replied evasively. "Who doesn't know who you really are?" added Thomas. "Each day that passes without revealing it, the situation becomes more complicated." Alexander knew his assistant was right. What had begun as a business experiment had transformed into something much more complex and personal, and Victoria was at the center of that transformation. "I'll find a solution for the ball," he said finally, evading the deeper issue. Perhaps a brief appearance as Alexander Reed at the beginning, and then a late entrance as Albert, when attention has diminished. After ending the call, Alexander remained for a long time contemplating the city from the window of his temporary apartment. The nightlights drew urban constellations, with Reed Tower standing out among all, illuminated and majestic. Two worlds, two identities. And in the middle, a man who was no longer sure which one better reflected who he really wanted to be. Saturday arrived faster than expected. The ball was being held in the grand ballroom of the most prestigious hotel in the city, elegantly decorated with corporate colors and a subtle theme celebrating Reed Enterprises' 25 years. As they had planned, Alexander made a brief appearance as himself at the beginning of the event. Dressed in an impeccable designer suit, he delivered a concise speech about the importance of innovation and human capital, taking the opportunity to justify his absence with vague comments about transformative projects that required his personal attention. He observed the attendees with new eyes, now recognizing not only the executives he normally interacted with, but also many employees of different levels he had met during his time as Albert. He saw Steve nervously conversing with his wife in a corner, James proud with his 3 now adult children, Betty elegantly dressed next to her cleaning colleagues. And he saw Victoria. She wore a deep blue dress, simple but elegant, and her hair, normally pulled back, fell in soft waves over her shoulders. She didn't wear ostentatious jewelry like many female executives, just small earrings that she had once mentioned were inherited from her grandmother. She was busy ensuring everything ran smoothly, helping to integrate groups that normally wouldn't interact, with that natural ability to make everyone feel included. Their gazes briefly crossed across the room. She greeted him with a polite but distant gesture, the kind of acknowledgement a mid-level employee would offer to the company's CEO. Nothing more. Alexander felt a strange disappointment. This woman he had come to know so well in recent weeks, with whom he had shared deep conversations and moments of genuine connection, now looked at him as a stranger. Because for her, Alexander Reed was indeed a stranger. After completing his appearance, he discreetly withdrew, using a secondary exit and heading to a room reserved at the same hotel. There, with Thomas's help, he transformed back into Albert. Disheveled hair, glasses, carefully maintained beard, and a modest suit he had bought especially for the occasion. When he returned to the ballroom, the party was in full swing. The atmosphere had considerably relaxed after the CEO's departure, and Victoria's initiatives to integrate employees of different levels seemed to be working. He saw mixed groups animatedly conversing, executives sharing tables with administrative staff, even some members of the maintenance team participating in the organized activities. "You made it!" Victoria's voice startled him. He turned to find her smiling, with a sparkle in her eyes that she hadn't shown when greeting Alexander Reed minutes before. "I couldn't miss it," he replied, feeling a knot in his stomach at the duplicity of his situation. "Come," she said, taking his arm with a naturalness that surprised him. "I want to introduce you to some people." During the next hour, Alexander experienced his own company from a completely new perspective. As Albert, he was received with genuine smiles, included in authentic conversations, treated as an equal by people who, minutes before, had been rigidly formal with the CEO. The irony didn't escape him. As Alexander Reed, he possessed all the power and no real connection. As Albert, he had no formal power but had formed authentic bonds. When the orchestra began playing dance music, Victoria looked at him with an expression that was both amused and challenging. "Do you dare?" she asked, discreetly pointing toward the dance floor. "I'm not a very good dancer," he replied honestly. The mandatory ballroom dance classes during his privileged youth had little to do with the relaxed atmosphere on the dance floor. "Neither am I," she smiled. "But I think that's the point. It's not about doing it perfectly, but about enjoying the moment." That simple phrase seemed to summarize the philosophy of life that attracted him so much about Victoria. On the dance floor, Alexander tried to follow the rhythm of the music, aware of his initial clumsiness, but becoming increasingly relaxed under Victoria's natural guidance. They danced several pieces, some fast, others slower, and in each one he felt how the barriers between them dissolved a little more. During a particularly emotional ballad, with Victoria in his arms moving softly to the beat of the music, Alexander experienced a clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just attraction he felt for this woman, but a much deeper connection based on shared values, on a worldview that he had forgotten was once also his own. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "About masks," he replied, perhaps too honestly. "About how sometimes we hide ourselves so much that we forget who we really are." Victoria looked at him intensely, as if trying to decipher something in his eyes. "You know, since I met you, I've had the feeling there's more to you than you let on," she said finally, "as if you were looking for something." "Maybe I am," he admitted. "Maybe I'm rediscovering parts of myself I had forgotten." The music ended, but they remained a moment longer on the dance floor, connected by something that went beyond words. The rest of the night passed like a dream, with moments of shared joy, meaningful conversations, and that growing sensation that something important was being born between them. When Alexander accompanied Victoria to the taxi that would take her home, they both paused for a moment, under the soft light at the hotel entrance. "Thank you for convincing me to come," he said, aware that these simple words contained much more than he could express. "Thank you for being you," she replied, leaning in to place a soft kiss on his cheek. "See you Monday, Albert." As he watched her leave in the taxi, Alexander touched his cheek where Victoria's lips had left an invisible but profound mark. At that moment, he understood that his experiment had crossed an irreversible line. What had begun as corporate research had become a personal search for authenticity. And in that search, Victoria wasn't just another employee, but possibly the person who was showing him the way back to himself. The Monday following the ball, Alexander arrived early at Reed Tower, driven by renewed energy. The memories of Saturday night remained vivid in his mind. The music, the conversations, the dance, and above all, that moment with Victoria under the lights at the hotel entrance. Something had changed between them, a connection that went beyond the casual friendship they had developed over the past few weeks. Upon entering the building as Albert, the maintenance employee, he was greeted with familiar smiles and greetings. The same people who before would hardly have noticed his presence as CEO now recognized him as part of their work community. "What moves on the dance floor, Albert?" joked Steve as they entered the service elevator together. "Never imagined our new technician would turn out to be quite the dancer." Alexander laughed, remembering how he had indeed ended up participating in an impromptu dance contest toward the end of the night, something he would never have done as Alexander Reed. "It was a special night," he replied simply. "And you weren't the only one who noticed," added Steve with a knowing smile. "Victoria doesn't usually dance that much at these events." Before Alexander could respond, the elevator stopped at the maintenance floor, and they both headed to the morning task assignment meeting. To his surprise, his first task of the day took him directly to the 15th floor. "Problem with the ventilation system in the main office," Steve read from the list. "Albert, since you already know that floor well, it's yours." With a mixture of anticipation and nervousness, Alexander headed to the social responsibility department. Upon arrival, the receptionist indicated that Victoria was in a meeting, but that he could go directly to her office to check the system. Victoria's office perfectly reflected her personality, organized but welcoming, professional but with personal touches. Photographs of community projects decorated one wall, while small plants gave life to the space. On her desk, among orderly documents, a frame stood out with the photo of an older woman whom Alexander assumed would be her grandmother, from the resemblance and from that story about the inherited earrings. While examining the ventilation system, Alexander noticed an open folder on the desk. He didn't intend to spy, but a name immediately caught his attention. Restructuring Proposal, Reed Foundation. Curiosity overrode his discretion. Taking a quick glance at the door to make sure he was still alone, he briefly browsed the document. It was a detailed analysis of the charitable foundation that bore his name, pointing out inefficiencies, administrative duplications, and missed opportunities. The report was impressive, methodical, based on concrete data, and with specific recommendations that could triple the impact of resources without significantly increasing the budget. The kind of analysis he would have paid a fortune to external consultants for. "I see you found my personal project." Victoria's voice startled him. He hadn't heard her enter. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." He began to apologize, genuinely embarrassed by the intrusion. "Don't worry," she replied, approaching. "It's not a secret, just a project I work on in my spare time." "It's impressive," Alexander said sincerely. "Very detailed. Thank you. I've been collecting data and studying more efficient models for months." Victoria took the folder and looked at it with a mixture of pride and resignation. "Although I doubt it will ever reach the hands of someone who can actually implement these changes." Alexander felt a pang of guilt. "Why don't you present it formally?" "I've tried 3 times," she smiled without bitterness. "But you know how hierarchy works. My report gets to a certain level and then gets lost in administrative limbo. The big boss is too busy for these details, I suppose." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He, Alexander Reed, the big boss, so busy and inaccessible, was now right in front of her, listening to an uncomfortable truth about his own isolation. "Maybe you should be more insistent," he suggested, wishing he could tell her he would implement each of her recommendations as soon as he officially returned to his position. "Perhaps," she conceded, "but that's not what I wanted to talk to you about this morning." "No?" Alexander noticed a change in her tone, something more personal. "I wanted to thank you for Saturday," said Victoria, holding his gaze. "It's been a long time since I enjoyed an evening so much." "Me too," he replied, feeling how the atmosphere between them charged with a pleasant tension. "I was wondering if maybe," she began with unusual hesitation in someone normally so confident, "if perhaps you'd like to continue our conversation outside of work. Dinner, maybe." Alexander's heart skipped a beat. The proposal filled him with joy, and at the same time, anxiety. How could he deepen a relationship based on a false identity? "I'd love to," he responded with sincerity, while his mind frantically sought a solution to his moral dilemma. They agreed to meet that evening at a small downtown restaurant, a simple place but with excellent local food, according to Victoria. While he finished checking the ventilation system, Alexander struggled with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, he longed to get to know Victoria better outside the work context. On the other, he knew that each step they took together made the inevitable revelation of his true identity more difficult. The day passed slowly, each minute loaded with anticipation. When the time for their meeting finally arrived, Alexander had made a decision. That night, he would be completely honest with Victoria, within the limits of his experiment. He wouldn't yet reveal his true identity, but he wouldn't build more fictions about his past or his intentions either. The restaurant was exactly as she had described it, a cozy space with wooden tables, warm lighting, and the aroma of traditional dishes prepared with care. Victoria was waiting for him at a table by the window, dressed with simple elegance, her smile lighting up as she saw him enter. The conversation flowed naturally as they shared appetizers and anecdotes about Saturday's ball. Alexander found himself laughing more than he remembered laughing in years, feeling a freedom he never experienced in business dinners or social events he attended as CEO. It was during the main course when the conversation took a deeper turn. "Can I ask you a personal question?" Victoria asked after a moment of contemplative silence. "Go ahead," he replied, preparing to carefully navigate between truth and his necessary discretion. "What are you really looking for at Reed Enterprises? Because I have the impression it's not just a maintenance job." The question took him by surprise. Had he been so obvious, or was she simply extraordinarily perceptive? "What makes you think that?" he asked, buying time. "Little details," she replied, watching him carefully. "The way you analyze the company dynamics, your questions about corporate policies, your interest in social projects, these aren't typical priorities for someone who's just looking for a bi-weekly paycheck." Alexander carefully considered his response. This was the moment to approach the truth without completely revealing it. "You're right," he finally admitted. "I'm in a moment of personal re-evaluation, trying to understand how companies really work. Not from theory or from the top, but from the people who make them up day to day." "Some kind of sociological research?" she asked, intrigued. "Something like that," he nodded. "I want to understand what makes a company more than a mechanism for generating profits. What turns it into a space where people can grow, contribute, feel valued?" Victoria's expression lit up with genuine interest. "That's exactly the question that has guided my career," she said passionately. "I firmly believe that companies can be positive, transformative forces, not just for their shareholders, but for the communities where they operate, for their employees, for society in general." "And yet many aren't," commented Alexander, thinking of his own decisions as CEO. "Because most are trapped in an obsolete model that artificially separates economic success from social well-being," she replied with conviction. "As if they were opposing objectives, when in reality they can mutually reinforce each other." The conversation continued, delving into these topics, with Victoria sharing experiences of successful projects and Alexander offering perspectives that mixed his knowledge as a businessman with the new observations acquired during his time as an employee. When desserts arrived, Victoria surprised him again. "You know, there's something I haven't told you," she said with a more personal tone. "Something about my past that perhaps explains my passion for changing things from within." "I'd love to hear it," he replied with genuine interest. 3 years ago, I was engaged to Robert Wilson." The name fell like a bomb. Robert Wilson was Alexander's main competitor, owner of Wilson Corporation, and known for his aggressive business tactics. "That's a surprise," he managed to articulate, struggling to maintain a neutral expression. "We met at a corporate responsibility congress, ironically," she continued. "At first, he seemed to share my values. He spoke passionately about ethical business and sustainable development. But over time, I discovered that for him, it was just an image strategy, not a real conviction." Alexander listened attentively, aware of the delicate position he found himself in. He knew Wilson well, they had been rivals for years, but hearing about him from this personal perspective was disconcerting. The breaking point came when I discovered that one of his subsidiaries was acquiring land through legally questionable but ethically reprehensible tactics, continued Victoria. Entire communities were being pressured to sell at unfair prices. When I confronted him, his response was that that's how business works in the real world. The story resonated uncomfortably with some of the decisions Alexander himself had made in the past, justifying them with similar logic. So you ended the relationship, he concluded. It was more complicated, she sighed. I first tried to change things from within, to convince him to adopt more ethical practices. But finally I understood that some people don't want to change because the current system benefits them too much. A reflective silence settled between them as Alexander processed the implications of this revelation. Not only had Victoria been engaged to his main competitor, but she had ended the relationship for ethical reasons that could potentially apply to some of his own business practices as well. "And what brought you to Reed Enterprises after that experience?" he finally asked. "I researched all the major corporations," she replied. "Reed isn't perfect, but it has real potential. There are genuine projects, although scattered and sometimes poorly managed, and something about its original founder, Alexander Reed's father, his initial vision before the company grew so much, that attracted me." Alexander felt a mixture of pride and shame. His father, despite his lessons about distrust in business, had founded the company with solid principles that he had been diluting in the name of efficiency and growth. "And what do you think of the son?" he couldn't help asking. "Of Alexander Reed?" Victoria considered the question for a moment. "It's complicated," she said finally. "I don't really know him. Nobody does except perhaps his closest circle. From a distance he seems brilliant but distant, focused on results but disconnected from the people who make those results possible." Each word was like an uncomfortable mirror reflecting the image he had projected for years. "However," she continued, "sometimes I see glimpses of something more in his decisions. The foundation that bears his name does important work despite its inefficiencies, and occasionally he implements policies that suggest a broader vision of what a company can be, as if there was an internal struggle between the ruthless financier and someone who wants to build something more meaningful." The accuracy of her analysis left him momentarily speechless. Victoria had seen something in him that he himself hadn't fully recognized, that constant tension between the pragmatic businessman and the idealist who had never completely disappeared. "That's an interesting perspective," he managed to respond. The evening continued, drifting toward lighter topics, sharing childhood stories and dreams for the future. When they finally left the restaurant, the spring night enveloped them with a gentle breeze and the starry sky over the city. They walked slowly, extending their time together until they reached Victoria's apartment. At the door, there was a moment of silence filled with possibilities. "Thank you for tonight," she finally said, "for listening, for sharing." "Thank you for your honesty," he replied, aware of the irony of his words. When their gazes met, there was a mutual recognition that what was growing between them was special. Alexander leaned in slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished, but Victoria moved closer, and their lips met in a soft but intense kiss that seemed to suspend time. When they separated, Victoria gave him one last look that contained both promise and questions. "Good night, Albert," she said softly before entering her building. "Good night, Victoria," he replied, watching her disappear behind the door. As he walked back to his temporary apartment, Alexander faced the most significant revelation of his experiment so far. Not only was he rediscovering his company and its original values, but he was falling in love with a woman who knew him as Albert, but who would have to accept him as Alexander. And he wasn't sure that would be possible when the truth came to light. The following weeks passed in a strange duality for Alexander. On one hand, his relationship with Victoria flourished in moments stolen during shared lunches, occasional dinners, and a weekend visit to a community project where she volunteered. On the other hand, the complexity of maintaining his double identity increased with each passing day. As Albert, he experienced a freedom and authenticity he had never known. Conversations with Victoria allowed him to explore ideas and values without the filter of his position or fortune. He discovered facets of himself that had remained dormant for years. His capacity for genuine empathy, his interest in social impact beyond statistics, his enjoyment of simple pleasures that money couldn't buy. Simultaneously, as Alexander Reed, he continued directing his business empire remotely, making crucial decisions through Thomas, participating in strategic video conferences from remote locations, and managing crises that required his direct intervention. But something had changed in his approach. The conversations with Victoria, the observations made as a maintenance employee, and the human connections formed during these months were subtly influencing his executive decisions. On a particularly busy morning, Alexander was on the 12th floor repairing a lighting system when he heard a familiar voice that left him paralyzed. Alexander Reed, is that you? He turned slowly to find himself face to face with Edward Monroe, a former university classmate with whom he had maintained a cordial but distant relationship over the years. Edward now ran a technology consulting firm that occasionally provided services to Reed Enterprises. "Excuse me, sir," Alexander replied, trying to disguise his nervousness and slightly modifying his voice. "You're confusing me with someone else." Edward observed him intensely, narrowing his eyes. "It's extraordinary," he finally murmured. "You could be Alexander Reed's twin brother. Sorry for the confusion, it's really incredible, the resemblance." "I've been told before," Alexander replied with a forced smile, mentally thanking that his disguise included elements like glasses, a beard, and the change in his hairstyle. "What's your name?" asked Edward, still not completely convinced. "Albert Wilson, sir. Maintenance." Edward nodded slowly, still studying him with curiosity. "Well, Albert, if you're ever interested in a better-paying job, look me up. With that resemblance, you could work as Reed's official double. He'd surely pay well to have someone attend boring events in his place," he added with a laugh. Alexander forced a polite smile as Edward continued on his way, clearly still disconcerted but accepting the explanation. Once alone, he exhaled deeply, aware of how close he had been to being discovered. This incident was a clear sign. His experiment was approaching a critical point where the risk of exposure increased exponentially. That afternoon, while performing routine maintenance in the offices on the 15th floor, Victoria entered unexpectedly. Her expression was indecipherable, a mixture of confusion and determination that immediately put Alexander on alert. "Can we talk for a moment?" she asked, closing the door behind her. "In private." "Of course," he replied, setting aside his tools, a feeling of apprehension growing inside him. Victoria approached slowly, observing him with an intensity that made him feel completely transparent. "Something strange happened today," she began. "Edward Monroe came to my office to discuss implementing a new system. During our conversation, he mentioned having seen a maintenance employee with an astonishing resemblance to Alexander Reed." Alexander felt his pulse quicken, but maintained a neutral expression. "It was an interesting coincidence," continued Victoria, "because a few days ago, while reviewing files of old projects, I found a photograph of Reed from a few years ago, before he adopted his current polished image. And I noticed something in that photo, a specific gesture." She paused, her eyes never leaving Alexander's. "The same gesture you make when you're concentrated. A particular way of furrowing your brow and touching your left temple with your thumb." Alexander remained motionless, aware that any reaction could confirm Victoria's suspicions. "At first I thought it was an absurd coincidence," she continued. "But then I started noticing other things. Your unusually deep knowledge of the corporate structure, your questions about policies that would rarely interest a maintenance technician, your way of analyzing problems from an almost executive perspective." She took another step closer, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Who are you really, Albert? Or should I say, Alexander?" The moment he had feared and anticipated for weeks had finally arrived. Alexander briefly considered maintaining the charade, inventing explanations for each observation. But something in Victoria's direct and honest gaze made the idea of continuing to lie seem unbearable. "How long have you known?" he finally asked, his voice unconsciously recovering the nuances and natural tone of Alexander Reed. Victoria's expression transformed into a mixture of astonishment and vindication. One thing was to suspect, another very different to receive confirmation. "I've suspected for 2 weeks," she replied, "but I wasn't completely sure until this moment. Why didn't you say anything?" I wanted to understand why the CEO of one of the most important companies in the country would be pretending to be a maintenance employee, she replied with surprising calmness. I wanted to see what you would do, what you would say, what you would learn, without knowing that I had discovered you. Alexander nodded slowly, recognizing the intelligence of her approach. You're extraordinary, he said with sincere admiration. And you're an extraordinary liar, she replied, though without the harshness her words might suggest. The question is why? Alexander sighed deeply. It was time for the truth, in every sense. It all started a few months ago, he explained. I accidentally overheard some executives discussing my disconnection from the reality of the company, especially with employees of lower ranks. As he related the complete story, from the overheard conversation to the impulsive decision to experience life from another perspective, Victoria listened attentively, her expression changing from surprise to understanding, and finally to something more complex that Alexander couldn't decipher. So it's all been a corporate experiment, she said when he finished his explanation. A way to better understand your company to run it more efficiently. At first, yes, admitted Alexander, but it became something more, much more. What do you mean? I started looking for information about the company but found revelations about myself, he replied with an honesty that surprised him. About the man I've become and the man I could be. About values I had forgotten and human connections I had sacrificed in the name of success. Their eyes met in a moment of shared vulnerability. And I found you, he added in a low voice. The real you, not the department director interacting with the CEO, but the passionate, brilliant and authentic woman who would have gone unnoticed from my ivory tower. Victoria remained silent, processing his words, her gaze impossible to read. What about us? She finally asked. About everything we've shared these weeks? Was that also part of the experiment? That was the most real part of all, Alexander replied without hesitation. Each conversation, each shared moment. For the first time in years, I wasn't playing a role or calculating advantages. I was simply being myself, discovering parts of me that I had forgotten. And you expect me to believe that? Her tone hardened slightly. After discovering that our entire relationship has been based on a false identity, I don't expect anything, he replied with humility. I can only offer you the truth now. What you do with it is up to you. Victoria took a few steps away, creating physical distance while clearly processing the torrent of revelations. I need time, she said finally, to process all of this, to decide what it means for me, for us. I understand, Alexander nodded. Take all the time you need. She headed toward the door but stopped before leaving. One last question, she said, turning to look at him again. Everything I told you about my life, my ideas, my criticisms of the company, are you going to use it now that you're going back to being the big boss? The question reflected a legitimate concern that Alexander hadn't fully considered, how his position of power could now recontextualize all the confidences shared. Only in the way you choose, he replied sincerely. Your ideas are valuable, your criticisms are well-founded, and I'd like to implement many of your proposals, but never without your knowledge or against your will. Victoria nodded slowly, accepting his answer without committing further. I need to think, she said finally before leaving Alexander alone with the weight of the truth finally revealed. That night in his temporary apartment, Alexander contemplated the city from his window while waiting for the scheduled video call with Thomas. When his assistant appeared on the screen, his expression already indicated he had important news. Sir, we have a situation, Thomas began without preamble. Robert Reed has returned. The news fell like a cold shower. Robert, his second cousin, had been part of the board of directors years ago, until a disagreement about the company's direction had culminated in his forced departure. What do you mean he's returned? Asked Alexander, feeling how his attention was divided between this new crisis and the situation with Victoria. He's been quietly buying shares through shell companies, explained Thomas. He just announced that he controls 17% of the company and is looking for alliances with other discontented shareholders to launch a hostile takeover, taking advantage of your mysterious absence. Alexander quickly processed the information. Robert had always been ambitious and vindictive, a dangerous combination. His return during this period of vulnerability couldn't be a coincidence. How much time do we have? "He has called an extraordinary shareholders' meeting in 3 weeks," replied Thomas. "He's questioning your leadership, suggesting that your prolonged absence demonstrates disinterest or incompetence." Alexander felt how two worlds violently collided: the corporate reality he had tried to keep at a distance during these months, and the new personal reality he had built as Albert. "I need to return," he said finally, "to prepare my official return." "Will you end your experiment earlier than planned?" asked Thomas. "Not exactly," Alexander replied after a reflective pause. "Rather, the time has come to integrate what I've learned, to become a new type of leader." As he ended the call and contemplated the illuminated profile of Reed Tower in the distance, Alexander understood that he had reached a turning point. The recognition of his true identity by Victoria and the threat from Robert converged to force a decision he could no longer postpone. It was time for Albert and Alexander to finally become one person. The following days passed in a strange limbo for Alexander. He continued attending work as Albert, diligently fulfilling his maintenance responsibilities, but the atmosphere had subtly changed. Victoria maintained a professional distance, treating him with polite formality when they crossed paths, without the shared lunches or deep conversations that had characterized their relationship. Each distant interaction was a painful reminder of the damage caused by his deception, regardless of his initial good intentions. He wanted to explain himself better, delve into the reasons that had led him to maintain the charade for so long, but he respected Victoria's request to give her space to process everything that had happened. Meanwhile, he worked with Thomas on the strategy to counter Robert's threat. His cousin had been shrewd, taking advantage of his absence to sow doubts among shareholders and investors. The rumors about his strategic retreat had evolved into speculation about health problems, burnout, or even covered-up scandals. "We need to announce your return with a clear plan," Thomas insisted during their nightly video calls. "Something that demonstrates that your absence had a defined strategic purpose." "It did," Alexander replied firmly, "although it wasn't the one we initially communicated." One afternoon, while reviewing an electrical system in the building's basement, Alexander heard voices approaching. He instinctively hid behind some panels, not wanting to interrupt what seemed like a private conversation. "Can't believe it," said a voice he recognized as Richard's, his financial director. "Robert Reed back in the game." "That man was always a ruthless shark." "Worse than Alexander, certainly," replied another voice belonging to Martin, operations director. "At least Reed has certain ethical limits, even if minimal. Robert wouldn't hesitate to dismantle entire departments if they increase short-term profitability." "The social responsibility department would be the first to fall," commented Richard. "Robert always considered it an unnecessary expense." "Victoria and her team wouldn't stand a chance," agreed Martin. "It's a shame. They've done extraordinary work with limited resources." Alexander remained motionless until the voices moved away, processing what he had just heard. It wasn't just his position that was at stake, but the future of the company he had built and the people who depended on it. People like Victoria, whose work could disappear under Robert's ruthless leadership. That night, unable to sleep, Alexander made a decision. It was time to integrate the lessons learned during his time as Albert with the responsibilities he had as Alexander Reed. The experiment had served its purpose. It had shown him not only the weaknesses of his company, but also his own, and had revealed a path toward more human and meaningful leadership. The next morning he left an envelope on Victoria's desk. It wasn't a love letter or an elaborate justification, but a formal invitation. "Dear Ms. Owen, your presence is required at a confidential meeting this Friday at 6 p.m. in the executive suite of the Metropolitan Hotel. The topic to be discussed is the future of Reed Enterprises and your role in the upcoming restructuring. Sincerely, Alexander Reed." It was risky. She could reject the invitation, refuse to participate in any plan he proposed, but he needed to give her the opportunity to be part of the transformation he was contemplating, a transformation inspired largely by her ideas and values. Friday arrived with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Alexander had spent the last few days meticulously preparing his strategy, both for facing Robert and for presenting his new vision to Victoria. Thomas had coordinated his official return for the following Monday, with a press conference and an extraordinary board meeting. At 6 sharp, dressed again as Alexander Reed, but subtly maintaining some elements of Albert. The beard shorter but present, glasses now with more elegant frames. He waited in the hotel suite. The room had been prepared not as an ostentatious luxury space, but as a functional work environment, with organized documents, prepared projections, and a simple coffee service. At 6:10, when he was beginning to fear that Victoria had decided not to come, a knock on the door announced her arrival. Upon opening it, Alexander found himself facing a formal and professional Victoria, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming," he said, inviting her in. "Your invitation seemed important," she replied with a measured tone, "although I must admit I was surprised to receive it." "Please, sit down," Alexander indicated, pointing to the work table rather than the luxurious sofa. "There's much to discuss and little time." Once seated, Alexander went straight to the point. "Robert Reed, my cousin, is trying to take control of the company through a hostile takeover. If successful, he would implement radical changes focused exclusively on short-term profitability." Victoria nodded, her expression revealing that she was already aware of these rumors. "I intend to stop him," Alexander continued, "but not simply to maintain the status quo. My absence these months, my time as Albert, has clearly shown me that we need a fundamental change in the way we operate." He opened a folder and extracted a document that he slid toward her. "This is a preliminary plan for the restructuring of Reed Enterprises. It's not about cuts or mergers, but a complete reorientation of our corporate values and objectives." Victoria took the document cautiously, beginning to browse it with an increasingly surprised expression. "This is," she began, clearly impacted by what she was reading, "an implementation of many of the ideas you've defended for years," completed Alexander. "Integration of social responsibility in each operational division, measurement of community impact as a key performance indicator, restructuring of the Reed Foundation following exactly the model you proposed." Victoria looked up from the document, her eyes seeking confirmation that this wasn't some kind of elaborate manipulation. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to lead the implementation," Alexander replied without hesitation. "As Executive Director of Social Impact and Sustainable Innovation, reporting directly to me, with a permanent seat on the board of directors." The surprise on Victoria's face was evident. "It's a new position," he continued, "created specifically to integrate the values you defend into the core of our operations, not as an isolated department, but as part of our corporate identity." "And you expect me to accept just like that?" she asked, recovering some of her usual frankness. "After discovering that you've been lying to me for months, I expect you to consider the proposal on its merits, regardless of your feelings toward me," he replied honestly. "What I'm proposing isn't an empty gesture or a tactic to win your forgiveness. It's the direction I firmly believe the company should take." Victoria remained silent, studying the document again with professional intensity. "Many of these proposals are radical," she finally commented. "The board will resist." "No doubt," Alexander nodded. "That's why I need convinced allies, people who can defend this vision not only with data, but with passion. People like you. And Robert, how does he fit into all this?" "His strategy is based on painting me as a disconnected leader without a clear vision," explained Alexander. "This plan demonstrates exactly the opposite, a bold and progressive vision based on a deep knowledge of the company at all levels." He stood up and walked to the window, contemplating the illuminated city for a moment before turning back to her. "During these months as Albert, I've seen the company through new eyes. I've heard concerns, hopes, and frustrations that would never have reached the 20th floor. I've experienced the disconnection between executive decisions and their real impact on people." He paused, searching for the right words. "But most importantly, Victoria, is that I've gotten to know you, not as an employee interacting with the CEO, but as a brilliant, passionate, and authentic person. You've questioned my assumptions, challenged my perspectives, and without knowing it, reminded me of the kind of leader I once aspired to be." Victoria observed him with a complex expression, a mixture of professional caution, interest, and something more that was difficult to decipher. "What would happen if I reject the offer?" she finally asked. "The plan would move forward anyway, although probably with greater difficulty and less effectiveness," Alexander replied honestly. "Your participation isn't a condition, it's a hope." He sat down again in front of her, maintaining a respectful distance. I understand that your trust in me as a person is compromised, and you have every right to feel that way. I'm not asking you to forget or justify my actions. I only ask you to consider whether this vision for the company, regardless of how it arose, deserves your talent and dedication." Victoria remained silent for what seemed like an eternity, her gaze alternating between the document and Alexander. Finally, she closed the folder and stood up. "I need time," she said, picking up her purse, "to review this in detail and consider all the implications." "Of course," Alexander nodded, standing as well. "The board meeting is Monday at 10 Rs. If you decide to participate, I would need you there." As Victoria headed toward the door, Alexander added, "Regardless of your professional decision, there's something else I need to tell you." She stopped, turning to look at him. "What happened between us? The conversations, the shared moments, the feelings that arose, was the most authentic thing I've experienced in years," said Alexander, his voice revealing a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. "The irony is that I needed to become someone else to finally be myself." Victoria observed him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "The problem, Alexander, is that I fell in love with Albert," she finally replied, "and now I must discover if that person really exists, or if he was just another temporary mask." With those words, she left, leaving Alexander alone with the weight of his imminent choice. Not just the choice between maintaining or transforming his company, but the much more personal choice between returning to the man he had been or finally becoming the man he could be. The weekend passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Alexander, now officially back in his penthouse and gradually resuming his public identity, worked tirelessly with Thomas to finalize the details of his strategy. The restructuring plan he had presented to Victoria was just the tip of the iceberg. There were financial, legal, and operational implications that required meticulous planning. "The numbers for the last quarter are solid," Thomas commented as they reviewed the financial reports. "That gives us a certain advantage over Robert, but we can't underestimate him. He's been cultivating strategic alliances during your absence." Alexander nodded, studying the profiles of the board members and major shareholders. He knew each one well, their motivations, concerns, and ambitions. Some would respond to purely financial arguments. Others would value long-term stability, and a few, very few, would genuinely care about social impact and ethical vision. "Any news from Victoria?" Thomas asked cautiously, noticing how Alexander's attention occasionally drifted toward his phone. "Not yet," he replied, trying to maintain a professional tone that wouldn't reveal his inner uneasiness. Monday morning dawned clear and bright, as if nature wanted to contrast with the storm that was brewing at Reed Tower. Alexander dressed with studied precision, an impeccable but not ostentatious suit, a tie in somber tones, and, in a subtle nod to his time as Albert, he kept the short, perfectly trimmed beard and chose elegant glasses that framed his face without hiding it. Upon arriving at the building, the reaction was immediate. Employees at all levels noticed his presence, some surprised by the subtle changes in his appearance, others simply impressed to see him in person after his prolonged absence. Alexander surprised himself by greeting by name receptionists, security guards, and maintenance staff who had previously been practically invisible to him. In the elevator toward the boardroom on the 20th floor, Alexander experienced a strange, inverted déjà vu. These same hallways he had walked countless times, as the powerful CEO now revealed details he had only noticed as the humble maintenance technician. The slight unevenness in a tile in the hallway, the silent efficiency of the climate control system he himself had adjusted, the furtive glances of employees he now recognized by name, but couldn't greet without revealing his double identity. Upon entering the boardroom, he found most of the board already present. Richard, Martin, Ellen, the Human Resources Director, not the cleaning lady, and other high-level executives conversed in small groups, their nervousness barely disguised by professional formality. At one end of the long mahogany table, isolated but projecting confidence, was Robert Reed. At 50, Robert maintained the athletic appearance and predatory intensity that had always characterized him. His calculated smile upon seeing Alexander enter revealed both challenge and feigned cordiality. "The prodigy returns," commented Robert loud enough to be heard by everyone. "We hope your spiritual retreat has been enlightening." Alexander responded with a calm smile without letting himself be provoked. "More than you imagine, Robert. Thank you for your concern." The board members took their seats, unconsciously creating two factions, those loyal to Alexander on one side, potential allies of Robert on the other, and some undecided in the middle. The tension was palpable as Thomas distributed folders with the agenda and relevant documents for the meeting. Alexander noted with growing uneasiness that the chair reserved for Victoria remained empty. The minutes passed, and the meeting had to begin. Had she decided not to come, to reject his proposal? The possibility caused him a disappointment that went beyond the strategic implications. Just when he was about to officially start, the door opened and Victoria entered with a determined step. She wore a professional navy blue pantsuit, her expression serene but determined. Their gazes crossed briefly, and although her face revealed nothing, the simple fact of her presence sent a wave of relief through Alexander's body. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, standing up, "I appreciate your presence at this extraordinary meeting. As you know, my absence during these months has been part of a process of comprehensive strategic evaluation of our company." He paused, observing the reactions around the table. "What I present today is not simply a defense plan against the acquisition proposal of Mr. Robert Reed, but a transformative vision for the future of Reed Enterprises." Over the next hour, Alexander meticulously laid out his plan. He spoke of organizational restructuring, of integrating social responsibility into the core of the business, of community impact metrics, of employee wellness programs, of sustainable innovation. With each point, he backed his proposals with concrete data, financial projections, and case studies. "This approach doesn't sacrifice profitability," he emphasized, anticipating the main objection. "On the contrary, evidence shows that companies with a clear purpose and authentic commitment to their communities and employees generate superior returns in the long term and are more resilient during economic crises." The reactions were mixed. Some executives seemed genuinely intrigued, others skeptical, and a few, particularly Robert's allies, openly hostile. "Fascinating speech," Robert finally intervened with a condescending tone. "But I wonder if our shareholders will be willing to wait for those hypothetical, long-term benefits while you experiment with New Age corporate philosophies." Before Alexander could respond, Victoria raised her hand, requesting to speak. When Alexander nodded, she addressed the board with a confidence that impressed all present. "If I may," she began, "I'd like to provide some clarifications on the concrete results of similar approaches. We're not talking about abstract theories, but proven practices." With surgical precision, Victoria presented case studies, figures, and comparative analyses that demonstrated how integrating social values into corporate strategy generated measurable competitive advantages. Her mastery of the subject was evident, her passion contagious. "What Mr. Reed proposes," she continued, "is not a risky experiment, but the logical next step in the evolution of a company that wants to remain relevant and competitive in a world where consumers, talents, and investors increasingly value purpose and integrity." Alexander watched with admiration as Victoria conquered the room. She didn't speak like someone looking to impress her boss or secure a promotion, but as a convinced professional defending a vision she deeply believed in. The discussion intensified with questions, objections, and debates about specific details of the plan. Robert repeatedly attempted to discredit the proposals, but each time he found resistance not only from Alexander and Victoria, but also from board members who were beginning to see the merit of this new direction. After almost 3 hours of intense debate, Alexander proposed a 30-minute recess before proceeding to the preliminary vote. As the executives dispersed to make calls or converse in small groups, Alexander discreetly approached Victoria, who was reviewing some notes on her tablet. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "Your intervention was extraordinary." She looked up, her eyes reflecting a mixture of professionalism and something deeper that wasn't fully revealed. "I came for the plan, not for you," she responded frankly. "What you propose is what I've always advocated for. It would be hypocritical to reject it just because of personal circumstances." Alexander nodded, accepting the distance she maintained. "Does that mean you accept the position?" "It means I'm willing to work to implement this vision," she clarified. The specific details about roles and titles can be discussed later, if the board approves the general direction. Before they could continue their conversation, they were interrupted by Robert, who approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Impressive presentation, miss," he began, clearly not remembering or caring about her name. "Owen. Victoria Owen," she replied with cold professionalism. "Ah, yes. From the charity department," Robert commented dismissively. "I wonder if you've considered the real implications of this transformative plan. Because behind the scenes, what's really happening is a power struggle, isn't it, cousin?" He directed his penetrating gaze toward Alexander. "You mysteriously disappear for months, and just when someone questions your leadership, you return with a radical plan that conveniently adopts the current rhetoric on social responsibility. Quite opportune, don't you think?" "What's opportune, Robert?" Alexander replied calmly, "is that I've finally understood what my father was trying to build before people like you began to influence the direction of this company. Your father was an idealist who needed pragmatists like me to turn his dreams into a viable business," Robert replied with disdain. "My father understood something you've never comprehended," continued Alexander, his voice firm but controlled, "that a company isn't just a money-making machine. It's a living organism formed by real people with real impact on real communities." Robert laughed with disdain. "Corporate poetry. Very moving. But when shareholders see the realistic projections I've prepared, comparing your transformative approach with my plan for efficiency and profit maximization, the decision will be obvious." He walked away with confidence, leaving Alexander and Victoria momentarily in silence. "He's right about one thing," Victoria finally commented. "For many, this will seem simply a strategic maneuver to maintain control." "I know," Alexander nodded, "and perhaps at the beginning there was some of that. But what I've experienced these months, what I've learned from you, from Steve, from Betty, from so many others, has genuinely changed my perspective." Victoria studied him for a moment, as if evaluating the sincerity of his words. "I suppose we'll find out with time," she finally said. "Words are easy. Real changes require consistency and long-term commitment." With that observation, she returned to her seat as the board members began to gather again for the vote. The tension was palpable as Thomas distributed the ballots for the preliminary vote. This wouldn't be legally binding. The final decision would correspond to the General Shareholders' Assembly scheduled for the following week, but it would establish the official recommendation of the Board of Directors. As the executives marked their decisions, Alexander discreetly observed their expressions, trying to anticipate the outcome. Some seemed decided, others doubtful, and a few cast calculating glances between him and Robert, as if evaluating which side would be more beneficial for their careers. Thomas collected the ballots and proceeded to count them meticulously under the watchful eye of all present. Finally, he looked up and announced, "The result of the preliminary vote is 8 votes in favor of the restructuring plan proposed by Mr. Alexander Reed, 6 votes in favor of the alternative proposal of Mr. Robert Reed, and 2 abstentions." A murmur ran through the room as Alexander processed the information. The victory was narrow but sufficient to maintain momentum toward the shareholders' assembly. Robert maintained a tense smile, clearly not willing to admit defeat. "This is just the beginning, cousin," he commented quietly as he stood up. "The real battle will be before the shareholders, and I have a week to show them that your plan is financial suicide, disguised as corporate responsibility." With those words, he collected his documents and left the room, followed by his closest allies. The other executives gradually dispersed, some approaching Alexander to cautiously congratulate him, others maintaining a prudent neutrality. When the room was almost empty, Victoria approached Alexander again. "The vote was closer than I expected," she commented. "Robert is right about one thing. The real test will be with the shareholders." "I know," Alexander nodded. "We have a lot of work ahead." "We?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "If you're willing," he replied. "I'll need your help to refine the presentation, strengthen the arguments, prepare responses for the most likely objections. Professionally, I'm committed to this plan," Victoria confirmed. "But I want to make something clear. My participation doesn't mean I've forgotten or forgiven the deception." Alexander nodded, accepting the implicit condition. "I understand. Let's separate the personal from the professional for now. How about if we start tomorrow first thing? My office, 8 a.m. I'll be there, she responded professionally before collecting her things and heading toward the door. When she was about to leave, she stopped and turned slightly. By the way, she added with a softer tone, the beard suits you, makes you seem more human. With those words, she left, leaving Alexander with a small smile. It wasn't forgiveness, not even reconciliation, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough. The following days passed in a whirlwind of frantic activity. Alexander, Victoria, and a small trusted team worked practically without rest, refining the proposal, preparing presentations, anticipating objections, and developing strategies to win the support of key shareholders. The dynamic between Alexander and Victoria slowly evolved. During the first meetings, she maintained a strictly professional distance, limiting their interactions to discussions about the restructuring plan. Gradually, however, the shared enthusiasm for the vision they were building began to melt the barriers. Occasional moments of intellectual complicity reminded them of their conversations as Albert and Victoria, although the shadow of the deception still remained between them. One afternoon, while reviewing financial projections in Alexander's office, Victoria noticed something unusual on his desk. A small plant in a simple pot, identical to those that decorated her own office on the 15th floor. "New decoration?" she asked, pointing to the plant. Alexander smiled slightly. A reminder that even the most impersonal spaces can be humanized with small gestures. It was a reference to a conversation they had had months ago when she had explained to Albert her philosophy about creating work environments that reflected human values. The fact that he remembered that seemingly trivial detail surprised her. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by Thomas, who entered with a worried expression. "Sir, we have a problem," he announced, handing him a tablet. "Robert just sent this to all the major shareholders." Alexander quickly reviewed the document, his expression progressively hardening. It was a devastating analysis of the restructuring plan, using manipulated financial projections to show catastrophic consequences, and ridiculing the social responsibility elements as costly fantasies of a CEO disconnected from market reality. "This is blatant manipulation of the data," commented Victoria, who was reading over his shoulder. "He's comparing completely different scenarios and omitting critical factors." "I know," Alexander nodded, "but it's convincing for those who don't carefully examine the details. And you know many shareholders will only see the graphs and conclusions." He stood up and walked to the window, contemplating the city while considering his options. "We need to respond immediately," he decided, "point by point, dismantling each falsehood and manipulation. But we must also go beyond defense. It's time to present concrete evidence that our approach is already working." "What do you mean?" asked Victoria. "The pilot projects your department has implemented the real results, not just projections." He turned to Thomas. "Do we have the consolidated data from the last quarter for the community projects?" "Yes, sir," the assistant nodded. "And they're impressive. The technology training program has generated a social return on investment of 3.7 to 1, and the microcredit project is showing repayment rates of 98%. "Perfect," Alexander replied. "Victoria, I need you to prepare a presentation focused exclusively on concrete results. Data, testimonials, irrefutable evidence that this approach is not only ethically correct, but also financially sound." While they discussed the details of the strategy, they were again interrupted, this time by an urgent call. Thomas's expression upon seeing the caller ID indicated that the news wouldn't be good. "It's Richard, from the finance department," he informed. "He says it's critical." Alexander took the call on speakerphone so Victoria could hear. "Richard, what's happening?" "Robert is making aggressive moves," the financial director informed with evident concern. "He secured the support of the Blackwater Investment Fund for his acquisition. They're offering to buy shares at 15% above the current value." The news was serious. Blackwater was a fund known for its ruthless tactics and exclusive focus on short-term profitability. "How many shareholders have already accepted?" asked Alexander, maintaining his calm. "Still few, but the rumor is spreading rapidly. If we don't do something soon, we could face a domino effect." After ending the call, Alexander remained silent for a moment, evaluating the situation. Victoria watched him attentively, noticing how his expression gradually transformed from concern to determination. "Thomas, I need you to organize a press conference for tomorrow morning," he finally instructed, "and personally contact our 10 main shareholders. I want individual meetings with each one before the General Assembly." "What do you have in mind?" Victoria asked when Thomas left to execute the instructions. "It's time to change the rules of the game," Alexander replied, with an intensity that she recognized from his days as Albert. "Robert expects us to play defensively, to limit ourselves to protecting our position. But we're going to do exactly the opposite." Over the next few hours, Alexander and Victoria developed a bold strategy. Instead of simply defending against Robert's attacks, they would present a vision so powerful and convincing that it would completely change the terms of the debate. They worked well into the night, the office illuminated like a beacon in the mostly dark building. At some point, when the clock marked almost midnight, Victoria noticed that Alexander had momentarily become absorbed, contemplating a photograph on his desk that showed an older man next to a much younger Alexander. "Your father?" she asked, recognizing the resemblance. Alexander nodded. "Taken the day we opened the first office of Reed Enterprises. Before the expansion, before we became what we are now. What do you think he would think of all this?" The question arose spontaneously, without the professional caution that had characterized their recent interactions. Alexander considered the question for a moment, his gaze still fixed on the photograph. "I think he would be disappointed in how we allowed growth and financial success to eclipse the fundamental values," he replied honestly. "But I also think he would be proud of this moment, of this attempt to return to the essentials." He looked at Victoria, the vulnerability visible in his eyes. "He used to say that a company is like a tree. It can grow upward indefinitely, but if its roots aren't deep and healthy, it will eventually fall." Victoria nodded, recognizing the wisdom in those words. "It's a good principle to guide what we're trying to do," she commented. And for the first time since the revelation, she offered him a genuine smile, not calculated or professional, but a reflection of the connection they both continued to share despite everything. The morning of the press conference dawned clear and bright. The main economic and general media had responded to the call, intrigued by the dramatic corporate confrontation that was developing. The conference room of the most prestigious hotel in the city was filled with journalists, analysts, and observers from the corporate world. When Alexander took the podium, his presence radiated a quiet confidence that contrasted with the ruthless executive image many expected. At his side, forming a visibly united team, were Victoria, Thomas, and several other key executives who had decided to support his vision. "Good morning, everyone," Alexander began. "I thank you for your presence at this conference that marks a turning point not only for Reed Enterprises, but potentially for our understanding of what a modern corporation can and should be in the 21st century." Over the next hour, Alexander presented his vision with an eloquence and passion that surprised many. He didn't limit himself to defending against Robert's accusations or presenting cold financial projections. Instead, he spoke about the fundamental purpose of businesses in society, about genuine corporate responsibility, about sustainability as a competitive advantage, and about employee well-being as a key indicator of organizational success. "What I propose today," he continued, approaching the end of his presentation, "is not a choice between profitability and social responsibility. That's a false dichotomy that has limited our corporate imagination for too long. What I propose is an intelligent and strategic integration that generates value in multiple dimensions. For our shareholders, certainly, but also for our employees, for the communities where we operate, and for society as a whole." When it was Victoria's turn, her technical and precise presentation of concrete results perfectly complemented the broader vision articulated by Alexander. With data, graphs, and testimonials, she demonstrated how the pilot projects already implemented were generating tangible results, not only in social impact, but also in customer loyalty, talent retention, and operational efficiency. The most impactful moment came when Alexander announced, "As a demonstration of my personal commitment to this vision, I am investing 30% of my personal fortune in a social impact fund directly linked to the results of these new programs. My compensation as CEO will be partially linked to the fulfillment of social and environmental metrics, not just financial ones." The announcement generated a wave of surprise among the journalists. It was an unprecedented commitment that literally put Alexander's money where his words were. Toward the end of the conference, a journalist posed the inevitable question, "Mr. Reed, many speculate that this change of direction is simply a strategy to maintain control of the company in the face of the acquisition attempt by Mr. Robert Reed. How do you respond to those accusations?" Alexander considered the question for a moment, aware that his answer would be meticulously analyzed. "It's a valid question," he finally acknowledged. "And yes, this plan arose partly as a response to a challenge, but humanity's best advances frequently come from crises that force us to reevaluate our fundamental priorities and values." He paused, his gaze scanning the room before continuing. "Over the past months, I've experienced a personal and professional transformation. I've seen my own company from perspectives I had never before considered. I've heard voices that rarely reach the executive level, and I've rediscovered the original purpose that inspired the founding of Reed Enterprises more than 3 decades ago." His voice became more intense, more personal. "So yes, this proposal arises at a moment of corporate crisis, but its true origin is in a rediscovery of essential values and in the conviction that there is a better way to do business. A way that rejects the false choice between financial success and positive impact." The response resonated with many of those present, generating a murmur of approval that surprised even Victoria. At the end of the conference, as the journalists dispersed, some already frantically typing on their devices, Robert approached Alexander. He had remained observing from the back of the room, his expression indecipherable. "Impressive show," he commented with a tense smile. "You almost convinced me too." "It wasn't my intention to convince you, Robert," Alexander replied calmly, "but to offer our shareholders and the public a clear vision of what's really at stake." "What's at stake is the future of a multi-million-dollar company," Robert replied, abandoning pretenses of cordiality. "A company that you're willing to risk for a social experiment." "What's at stake," Alexander corrected, "is much more than that. It's the opportunity to redefine what business success means in our time." Robert laughed with disdain. "Always so idealistic, like your father. That's why he needed people like me to keep the company afloat while he dreamed of a better world." "My father understood something you've never comprehended, Robert," Alexander replied. "That dreams of a better world are precisely what gives meaning to everything else, including business success." Without waiting for a response, Alexander walked away to meet with his team, leaving Robert visibly irritated at not having had the last word. In the days that followed, the battle for control of Reed Enterprises intensified. Robert and his allies redoubled their efforts, individually contacting key shareholders, leaking negative information to the financial press, and increasing their acquisition offer to 20% above market value. Simultaneously, Alexander and his team worked tirelessly, meeting with investors, refining their proposal, and building a support coalition that included not only traditional shareholders, but also employees, customers, and community allies. In the midst of this corporate storm, the relationship between Alexander and Victoria continued to subtly evolve. The intense joint work, the shared commitment to a common vision, and the moments of vulnerability amid the stress were gradually rebuilding bridges that the initial deception had damaged. One afternoon, while reviewing documents in Alexander's office, a casual mention of a shared memory from their days as Albert and Victoria created a moment of tension. "I'm sorry," Alexander immediately apologized. "I didn't mean to—" "It's okay," she interrupted with a small smile. "We can't pretend those moments didn't exist. They were real, even if the circumstances were complicated." "Very real," he affirmed, holding her gaze. "In fact, they were the most authentic moments I've experienced in years." Victoria considered his words for a moment before responding. "You know what's hardest about all this? That when I'm with you now, sometimes I see glimpses of Albert. Gestures, expressions, ways of thinking, and I wonder how much of him was real and how much was a fabrication." "Everything essential was real," Alexander replied sincerely. "The circumstances were false, the background story was invented, but the conversations, the shared ideas, the moments of connection, that was completely authentic." Before Victoria could respond, they were interrupted by Thomas, who entered with urgent news. One of the main shareholders had decided to sell his shares to Robert, dangerously tilting the balance in favor of the hostile takeover. The General Shareholders' Assembly was rapidly approaching, and with it, the moment of truth for the future of Reed Enterprises and for the personal and professional transformation that Alexander was trying to materialize. The morning of the General Shareholders' Assembly dawned with a grey sky that seemed to reflect the tension of the moment. The grand hall of the International Convention Center gradually filled with men and women in formal suits, many of them representatives of investment funds, associated companies, and individual shareholders with significant stakes. Alexander discreetly observed from one side, while Thomas confirmed the final logistical details. According to his most recent calculations, the vote would be extremely tight. Robert had managed to secure approximately 46% of the votes, while Alexander counted on a relatively secure 43%. The remaining 11% corresponded to undecided shareholders or those who hadn't clearly revealed their position. "Everything is ready," Victoria informed, approaching after reviewing the final presentation. "Although Richard just told me that the Wellington Fund is still undecided. Their 3% could be decisive." Alexander nodded, aware of the fragility of his position. Over the past few weeks he had risked a lot, exposing a vision that many considered too idealistic or risky. But he had also gained unexpected admirers, people who saw in his proposal not just a business plan but a new corporate paradigm. "Are you nervous?" Victoria asked, studying his expression. "Strangely, no," he replied with a calm smile. "A few months ago, the idea of losing control of the company would have terrified me. It was my identity, my defining achievement. And now I understand there are things more important than control or conventional success," he replied, his gaze meeting hers. "What really matters is the impact we generate, the lives we touch, the values we uphold." Victoria observed him for a moment, clearly impressed by the transformation she perceived in him. "Well, let's hope the shareholders see the value of that perspective," she finally commented, returning to the pragmatism that the situation required. At 10 o'clock sharp, the assembly formally began. After the initial formalities and the presentation of financial reports, the central moment arrived, the presentation of the competing proposals for the future of Reed Enterprises. Robert was the first to take the floor. Impeccably dressed and projecting absolute confidence, he presented his vision with the precision of a surgeon and the aggressiveness of a predator. He spoke of operational efficiency, profit maximization, cost reduction, and strategic expansion. His plan was technically solid and financially attractive for those who prioritized short-term returns. "What I propose," he concluded with a calculated smile, "is to free Reed Enterprises from costly experiments and ideological distractions to return to the fundamentals, generating value for you, our shareholders. Under my leadership, I project a 35% increase in dividends for the next fiscal year. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters, isn't it?" The applause that followed was respectable, though not enthusiastic. Robert had presented a solid case from the purely financial perspective. When Alexander took the podium, the atmosphere subtly changed. Instead of immediately beginning with his presentation, he remained silent for a moment, observing the expectant faces before him. "Before showing you graphs, projections, and strategic plans," he finally began, "I'd like to ask you a fundamental question. What kind of company do we want to be?" He paused, allowing the question to resonate in the room. "It's not just about how much money we can generate, but about how we generate it, and for what purpose. It's not just about growing, but about how that growth impacts people inside and outside the organization." Over the next half hour, Alexander presented his vision with a combination of rigorous data and inspiring narrative. He spoke of vertical integration of social values, of sustainability as a competitive advantage, of workplace well-being as a driver of innovation. Unlike Robert, he complemented the financial projections with concrete stories. The community center that had transformed the life of Steve's son, the technical training program that had created opportunities for young people in vulnerable areas, the environmental initiatives that had reduced operational costs while improving the company's ecological footprint. "My father founded this company with a vision that went beyond profitability," he continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "He believed that a business organization could be simultaneously successful and human, profitable and ethical, ambitious and compassionate. He looked directly at the oldest shareholders, those who had known his father, before continuing. Over the years, I gradually moved away from that original vision. I prioritized numbers over people, results over purposes, efficiency over humanity, and although we built a financially successful company, we lost something essential in the process. An expression of recognition arose on some faces, especially among investors from the old guard. What I propose today is not a nostalgic return to the past, but an evolution toward a future where success is measured in multiple dimensions. A future where the value we create is distributed more equitably among shareholders, employees, customers, and communities. He concluded his presentation with a financial projection that, although more moderate than Robert's in the short term, showed a more sustained and resilient growth curve in the long term. The choice you face today, he finished, is not simply between two leaders or two business strategies. It's a choice about the type of capitalism we want to practice and the legacy we want to build. The silence that followed his words was profound, finally broken by applause that, although not universal, seemed genuinely moved. During the question session that followed, both Robert and Alexander defended their respective proposals under the scrutiny of shareholders and investors. The questions reflected the fundamental division. Some focused exclusively on short-term profitability projections, while others showed genuine interest in the more integrated vision that Alexander proposed. A particularly tense moment occurred when Victoria was directly questioned by a representative of a conservative investment fund. Miss Owen, as potential director of this new social impact division, can you guarantee that these initiatives won't compromise the financial returns we expect as investors? The question contained barely disguised skepticism. Victoria stood up calmly, her professional presence immediately capturing the attention of the room. What I can guarantee, she replied with clarity, is that each initiative will be evaluated with the same analytical rigor as any other business investment. The difference is that our success metrics will include both financial returns and measurable social impact. She paused before continuing. For years we've operated under the false premise that these objectives are mutually exclusive. The evidence shows the opposite. Companies with clearly defined purpose and authentic commitment to social values show greater resilience during economic crises, greater loyalty from customers and employees, and yes, more sustainable financial returns in the long term. Her response generated nods among several shareholders, including, Alexander noticed, the representative of the Wellington Fund, whose 3% could be decisive. When the time for voting arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. Alexander exchanged a look with Victoria, a silent communication that contained both hope and resignation. They had done everything possible. They had defended a vision they deeply believed in. Now the decision was in the hands of the shareholders. As the votes were being tallied, Robert approached Alexander discreetly. "Whatever happens today," he commented with a tense smile, "you fought better than I expected, cousin." "It's not about winning or losing, Robert," Alexander replied. "It's about defending what we believe is right." "Always so noble," Robert laughed with a certain disdain. "That's why you never really understood how this world works." "Maybe it's not about understanding how the world works," Alexander replied, "but about imagining how it could work better." Before Robert could respond, the President of the Assembly requested attention to announce the results. "After the final tally," he began formally, "the results are as follows. The proposal led by Mr. Robert Reed has received 48% of the votes. The proposal led by the current CEO, Mr. Alexander Reed, has received 52% of the votes." A murmur ran through the room as Alexander processed the information. They had won, but by a narrow margin that indicated a divided mandate. The transformation he proposed would not be an easy path. Robert's reaction was immediate and predictable. A forced smile, a calculatedly firm handshake in front of the cameras, and a quick exit that suggested the battle might not be completely over. As the shareholders and investors dispersed, many approaching to congratulate him or express their expectations, Alexander looked for Victoria. He found her animatedly conversing with a group of investors, clearly already working on building support for implementing the plan. When they finally managed a moment alone, in a quiet corner of the now almost empty hall, Alexander noticed something different in Victoria's gaze. A mixture of professional pride and something more personal, deeper. "We did it," she said with a genuine smile, although the margin was smaller than we expected. "The important thing isn't the margin," he replied, "but the opportunity to demonstrate that this vision can work, that there is a better way to do business." "It's going to be a difficult road," Victoria warned. "Robert and his allies will continue to pressure. Skeptical shareholders will expect immediate results, and transforming a corporate culture is never simple." "I know," Alexander nodded. "That's why I need you on this team. Not just for your professional experience, but for your personal conviction." Victoria observed him for a moment, as if evaluating something internally. "A few weeks ago," she finally said, "I told you that I had fallen in love with Albert, not with Alexander Reed. That I needed to discover if that person really existed or was just a temporary mask." Alexander nodded, perfectly remembering those words that had resonated in his mind constantly since then. "And now I'm beginning to see," she continued, "that perhaps the question was wrongly posed. Maybe it's not about choosing between Albert or Alexander, but recognizing that both are facets of the same person. That the man I knew as a maintenance technician and the CEO who has defended this vision today are in essence the same." Her observation touched something deep in Alexander, a truth that he himself had been processing for weeks. "For a long time," he confessed, "I defined myself exclusively by my position, my wealth, my power. Alexander Reed was a title, a function, a carefully constructed public image. Albert was initially a disguise, an experiment, but he became a liberation. He allowed me to rediscover parts of myself that I had forgotten or suppressed." He paused, searching for the right words. "Now I understand that my challenge isn't to choose between them, but to integrate them. To be a leader who doesn't sacrifice his humanity for power, a businessman who doesn't compromise his values for profit." Victoria nodded, a reflective smile illuminating her face. "That integration," she said softly, "is exactly what we propose for the company. Uniting purpose and profit, impact and profitability, values and value. It's poetic, isn't it?" Alexander smiled. "That personal and corporate transformation are so perfectly aligned." A comfortable silence settled between them, full of unarticulated possibilities. Finally, Victoria spoke. "We have a lot of work ahead. We should start as soon as possible." "You're right," Alexander nodded. "But first, there's something I'd like to ask you." "What is it?" "A second chance," he replied with simplicity, "not as boss and employee, not as CEO and director, but as two people who connected in a meaningful way and who could discover where that connection leads." Victoria considered him for a moment, her expression indecipherable. "It won't be easy," she finally warned. "There will be professional complications, personal ones, and trust, once damaged, takes time to completely rebuild." "I know," he nodded. "I don't expect it to be easy or immediate. I only ask for the opportunity to try." "In that case," she responded with a small smile, "I think we could start with dinner. Not at an elegant restaurant with the famous CEO Alexander Reed, but somewhere simple where we can simply talk, without disguises or titles." "I'd love that," he replied, his smile reflecting the renewed hope he felt. As they left the hall together, Alexander experienced a sensation of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The company had taken a new direction, one that honored its origins while evolving toward a more integrated and meaningful future. And he himself was on a parallel path, rediscovering his authenticity while building something new on more solid foundations. The challenge would be considerable, both professionally and personally. There would be resistance, skepticism, unexpected obstacles. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that the chosen path was perfectly aligned with his deepest values. And most importantly, he wouldn't walk that path alone. 1 year later, the dawn light filtered softly through the windows of Alexander's penthouse, illuminating the space that, like its occupant, had experienced a subtle but significant transformation over the past year. The ostentatious furniture had been replaced by warmer and more functional pieces. The once bare walls now displayed photographs of community projects and art by emerging local artists, and small plants decorated various corners, adding life to the space that was once clinically impersonal. Alexander observed the city awakening while sipping his coffee. Prepared with the same Colombian beans, he had learned to appreciate during his days as Albert, but which he now bought directly from a cooperative of small producers with whom Reed Enterprises had established a fair trade relationship. The year that had passed since the decisive shareholders' assembly had been simultaneously the most challenging and the most rewarding of his career. The implementation of the new corporate vision had faced expected and unexpected resistance. Executives entrenched in old practices, investors impatient for immediate results, competitors trying to discredit the approach as mere image strategy. Robert, as expected, had sold all his shares and launched a subtle but persistent media campaign against the company's new direction. "Capitalism with a human face is an oxymoron," he had declared in a recent interview. "You either maximize profits or you dedicate yourself to philanthropy. Trying to do both simultaneously only guarantees mediocrity in both." And yet, gradually, results began to emerge. The restructuring of the Reed Foundation, following the model originally proposed by Victoria, had tripled its impact without significantly increasing its budget. The new employee wellness programs had reduced staff turnover by 40%, generating significant savings in hiring and training. The sustainability initiatives not only improved the company's environmental footprint, but also reduced long-term operational costs. More importantly, the corporate culture was evolving. The distance between executives and base employees was gradually reducing. Innovative ideas flowed more freely through hierarchies that were once rigid. Decisions incorporated considerations that went beyond immediate financial impact. The sound of a notification interrupted his reflections. It was a message from Victoria. "Ready for the big day? See you at the office at 8 Rays. Bring your best smile for the cameras. V." Alexander smiled as he replied affirmatively. Today they were officially inaugurating the Community Innovation Center, a space where Reed Enterprises employees would collaborate directly with community members on projects of mutual benefit. The project was emblematic of the new corporate philosophy. It wasn't about unidirectional charity, but genuine collaboration that generated value for all parties involved. His relationship with Victoria had evolved as gradually and organically as the transformation of the company. That first dinner, without disguises or titles, had given way to more encounters, deep conversations, shared moments that were rebuilding the trust damaged by the initial deception. It hadn't been a path without obstacles. Working together while navigating an emerging personal relationship presented unique complexities. There had been misunderstandings, moments of doubt, difficult conversations about expectations and boundaries. But there had also been mutual discoveries, renewed connections, and a shared respect that deepened with each challenge overcome together. 6 months ago, Victoria had finally accepted moving into the penthouse with him, though with a specific condition, that they redesign the space together to reflect shared values, not just taste or status. The process had been revealing for both, each decision about the shared home reflecting in miniature the broader decisions about the life they were building together. As he prepared to head to the office, Alexander passed in front of the hallway mirror, briefly observing his reflection. He no longer saw the division between Albert and Alexander that had so concerned him a year ago. He simply saw a man in evolution, integrating the lessons learned, the connections formed, the values rediscovered. The journey to the office had also changed. Although he occasionally used his car for long distances or formal commitments, most days Alexander opted for public transportation, a decision that had initially surprised many employees who now occasionally found themselves sharing a subway car with the company's CEO. These small daily decisions, seemingly trivial, communicated more effectively than any official memorandum the genuine nature of the change he was leading. It wasn't about grand symbolic gestures, but constant coherence between declared values and concrete actions. Upon arriving at Reed Tower, Alexander greeted the security and maintenance staff by name. Steve, now director of the technical training program for young people from vulnerable communities, briefly stopped him to share the latest achievement of his son, now graduated in engineering and recently hired by the company's technological innovation department. "I never thought I'd see something like this, sir," Steve commented with evident pride. "My son working here not as maintenance staff, but designing the systems of the future." "He's earned it with his talent and effort," Alexander replied sincerely. We just created the opportunity for that talent to flourish. In the elevator to his office, Alexander reflected on these small moments of human connection that now formed an integral part of his experience as a leader. During his time as Albert, he had discovered the value of these interactions. Now, as a transformed CEO, he consciously cultivated them, recognizing that these networks of authentic relationships constituted the true fabric of a healthy organization. Victoria was waiting for him in the lobby of the executive floor, reviewing final details with the communications team. Her presence radiated the same passion and professional competence that had impressed him from the beginning, now complemented by a renewed confidence in her position as Executive Director of Social Impact and Sustainable Innovation. "Good morning, Director Reed," she greeted with a professional smile that contained a personal sparkle just for him. "Good morning, Director Owen," he replied, maintaining the formal tone they had agreed upon for public professional interactions. "Everything ready for the inauguration?" "Absolutely. The community representatives arrived early, very excited about the project. The media will be here in an hour, and we just confirmed the mayor's attendance." Together they reviewed the final details before heading to the new Community Innovation Center, strategically located on the ground floor of the building to maximize accessibility and symbolize the company's new philosophy of openness. The space was impressive: large collaborative areas with cutting-edge technology, meeting rooms with flexible design, rapid prototyping spaces, and a cafeteria operated as a social enterprise that employed people from vulnerable communities. The walls exhibited inspiring phrases along with concrete data on projects and results, uniting idealism and pragmatism in a visually impactful way. As guests began to arrive, community representatives, employees from various departments, media, local authorities, Alexander and Victoria toured the space, ensuring everything was perfect for the official inauguration. In a quiet moment, as they observed from a corner how the first visitors enthusiastically explored the facilities, Victoria commented, "Do you remember our first conversation about social responsibility? When you were Albert, and I had no idea who I was really talking to." "I remember it perfectly," Alexander smiled. "You gave me 30 seconds to convince you that I understood your vision. And now, a year later, that vision is coming to life," she reflected, observing the bustling space. "Not exactly as I imagined, but better, more integrated, more collaborative, more real. That's what happens when ideas meet lived experience," he replied. "My theoretical understanding and your practical experience, my access to resources and your deep knowledge of the needs. Together, we've created something that neither could have achieved individually." Victoria nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. A genuine synthesis, not a superficial compromise. When the time came for the official ceremony, Alexander took the microphone to welcome those present. His speech, brief but emotional, connected the inauguration of the center with the broader vision of corporate transformation they were implementing. "This space," he concluded, "represents our conviction that the best solutions emerge when different perspectives, experiences, and talents converge with a shared purpose. It's not about the company helping the community, but about genuine collaboration, where we all learn, contribute, and grow together." After the applause, he yielded the stage to Victoria, who presented the first projects that would be developed at the center. From technological initiatives to address local urban challenges, to educational programs jointly designed by employees and community educators. The inauguration was a resounding success. Business media, which had initially shown skepticism toward Reed Enterprises' new direction, now highlighted the innovative approach as a potential model for other corporations. Even more significant for Alexander was observing the natural interactions between executives, employees of various levels, and community members. The invisible barriers that traditionally separated these groups seemed to dissolve in the atmosphere of genuine collaboration they had created. Toward the end of the event, while most guests enjoyed the celebration cocktail, Alexander noticed Steve animatedly conversing with his son and a group of young students from the community. He approached discreetly, without interrupting, just to listen. "And that's how everything began to change," Steve was explaining. "About a year ago, when the boss disguised himself as a maintenance worker to get to know the company from the bottom up." Alexander tensed slightly. The story of his experiment had remained mostly confidential, known only to a reduced circle of people. "Did he really do that?" asked one of the young people, clearly impressed. "He did," confirmed Steve with pride. "He worked with me for months, fixed systems, learned about the building, got to know the real people who keep everything running, and that experience completely changed his perspective." "How did they discover him?" asked another student. "Well, that's another interesting story," Steve began before noticing Alexander's presence. "Mr. Reed, I was just telling these young people about your educational experience." Alexander smiled, recognizing that some stories eventually find their way to the light. "It's a story worth sharing," he admitted, "because it demonstrates something fundamental, that sometimes we need to radically change our perspective to see truths that were always in front of us." The young people looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. One of them, particularly brave, asked, "And what was the most important thing you learned during that time?" Alexander carefully considered the question before responding. "I learned that a company isn't its buildings, its shares, or its financial statements. A company is the people who make it up, the lives it touches and the values it represents through its daily actions." He paused before adding, "And I learned that the same applies to us as individuals. We aren't our titles, our possessions, or our external achievements. We are the connections we form, the impact we generate, and the values we uphold with our everyday decisions." The young people nodded, absorbing the depth of his words, while Steve smiled with evident approval. Later that night, after the last guest had left and the cleaning teams began their silent work, Alexander and Victoria walked quietly through the park near Reed Tower. The nocturnal city glowed around them as they reflected on the day's success. "You know what I was thinking today, observing everything we've accomplished this year?" Victoria commented as their intertwined hands swung gently between them. "What?" "That there's a beautiful symmetry in our story. You started an experiment to better understand your company, and in the process you found yourself. I was looking to transform a corporation from within, and found a partner who shared that vision more deeply than I imagined." Alexander nodded, appreciating the observation. "And the most extraordinary thing," she continued, "is that neither of us would have reached this point following the conventional path. We needed that unexpected detour, that break with the established, to discover possibilities we didn't even know existed." "As that poet said," Alexander replied, remembering a quote they had discussed during one of their first conversations as Albert and Victoria, "Sometimes you have to get lost to find the path you didn't know you were looking for." They stopped at a lookout that offered a panoramic view of the city, Reed Tower standing out elegantly among the illuminated buildings. From that distance, the skyscraper seemed simultaneously imposing and integrated into the urban fabric that surrounded it, a visual metaphor of the new balance they were building between business success and positive social impact. "I have something for you," said Alexander, taking a small box from his pocket. "A symbol of this new beginning." Victoria carefully opened the box, revealing a delicate silver pendant. It wasn't an ostentatious jewel of the kind the old Alexander would have chosen, but an artisanal piece, created by a collective of artisans who participated in one of the Reed Foundation's programs. The design represented two paths that initially followed separate trajectories but gradually converged until merging into one, forming a perfect circle. "It's beautiful," murmured Victoria, visibly moved by the symbolism. "Like our story," he replied, as he helped her put it on. "Separate paths that found their way to unite, creating something complete and meaningful. Under the light of the moon and the urban stars, with the city stretching at their feet and the future opening before them, Alexander and Victoria sealed this moment with a kiss that symbolized not only their personal connection, but also the broader integration that both were helping to build, between purpose and profit, between authenticity and success, between the world as it is and the world it could be. And in that perfect moment, Alexander understood with crystal clarity that his true fortune had never been in his bank account, his properties, or his corporate power. His true wealth resided in having found an authentic purpose, a genuine connection, and the courage to reinvent himself and his legacy. The disguised businessman had begun an experiment seeking to better understand his company, but in the process had discovered a much deeper truth, that the masks we wear sometimes allow us to reveal our true face, and that true love only flourishes when we have the courage to be authentically who we are meant to be.